you?
You're Ellen. Okay, so do we have any?
Okay, so this is, it's Kevin here in Membertou. I just wanted to let you know that the web stream is now streaming live at the firstnationhelp.com/live video. JR is in with some teachers in Eel Ground, New Brunswick, and he's the reason we're not seeing them is that he's streaming the site from them. And the Nova site that joined us last time wanted to join again, but that's from their facility. They're having a hard time dialing out. So basically, Tim, you're ready to go, and I'll change these. When you put on your PowerPoint, it goes full screen automatically, so you should be good to go. Have a good meeting.
All right, thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. You can hear us fine? Okay. Kevin, how do these presets work? I set the preset, but when I press, oh, never mind. It doesn't like, oh, there we go. That's so strange.
Just have to do it manually. There you go.
Microphone's on. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Bernard, and we're here in the Maupeltuewey School, and we're going to run a session on our learning resource this afternoon. So in the room, we do have a number of guests, and Don Julian is here. We have Lillian Marshall, and we have Sister Dorothy Moore, Ian Doucette from the Department of Education, and Jaime Batiste from the Treaty Education Initiative. And Peter Christmas just walked in the room.
Hi there.
And we do have, I think Mary Ellen Gugu is joining us in a few minutes. I did hear her voice. She's out there. And we have staff members from our Mi'kmaq Cultural Center. Leah Rosenmeyer's here, as well as Sheila Piero. So if there are any questions that you want to email, you can email them to Sheila at cmmns.com. So we'll just put that up onto the screen. And so if you have questions as we go through, we're going to have discussion at the end. So today we're just going to do an overview of the unit. We're going to have a little unit exploration with Dr. Don Julian and in the treaty True and False. And we're going to have a treaty discussion with Jaime leading discussion. And we'll also take the opportunity, just before we begin, to go over the website. So a lot of the information that we have, because I realize not everybody has a hard copy of the book, and the information is all available on our website. So we just want to help those that don't have copies of the book for you to be able to navigate that from the website. So before I begin, I would ask Sister Dorothy if she could help open our session with a prayer, please.
Gracious God, our Creator, we are grateful for this gathering. We are grateful for the gifts that you have given to all those who are responsible for making this possible. We hope to make a good effort in bringing good news to our students and to all the Mi'kmaq Nation relating to our history. And we ask you to continue to be with us and guide us as we move forward in our efforts for a better tomorrow. In this we pray.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Doris. Okay, so I'll call upon Leah Rosenmeyer to go through quickly the overview of the website and of the unit, and then we'll get into Dr. Don's discussion.
Hi everybody. So I'm just going to quickly go to our website to be sure that anyone who's listening and doesn't have the resource knows where they can find it online. So I'm going to go to you'll have to bear with us. We had to switch laptops right at the last minute here, so Mi'kma'n'kuom gets you to, as you saw on the first slide, gets you to our website. And this is just our landing page. It comes up with some Mi'kmaq language and phrases. And then this brings you into our home page. So on the home page, there are three primary menus to the website. There's a Sharing Our Stories, Ancestors Live Here, and Future Center. So I'm just going to steer you towards Sharing Our Stories, go down to Education and Outreach, over to Teaching About the Mi'kmaq. If I click on that, we'll come to a the primary education page for the resource. Faye, you'll have to help me scroll down here. Okay, sorry everyone. You'll note here that there's a PDF download. This will download the entire PDF of the document, and that there's also a link to supplementary materials. So if you want particular pieces of the unit, you would go to the supplementary materials. I would note also that the supplementary materials can be found on the menu up here. So there's two ways to get to it. So I will click, and then each of these files have been set up as individual downloads. So today we're working in contemporary issues in the Treaties section. As an example, here's the reprint of the treaty from 1752. It's a printable version. You can save it. You can use it right online, download it, etc. So each one of these files, the word scramble, all the black line masters are here. And anything that you find that's in this supplementary material, which has a couple of updates from the disc that's in the back of the volume for those of you who have that. But any of these have been, we've cleared copyright. You can use them and print them for educational purposes in your classrooms. Okay, so that's the website briefly. We would note that on the website and in the curriculum more broadly, there are a lot of other resources that will help you through any of the units. For example, in the healing section of the volume, there's an Indian residential school unit. There's a whole set of resources online for the IRS here, and that's likewise through the site. So we would encourage you to explore the site if you're looking for materials, or contact us if you are looking for further resource materials. So that's how to find the resource if you're with us today and haven't downloaded it yet. This is where you would find it. Okay? I'm gonna on page Maupeltuewey unit for primary to grade 3, and in grade 7 to 9 section on land loss and displacement. So we're working in this 4 to 6 age level, and on the treaties section. In the treaties unit, there is an introduction that was written by the group of experts who came together to create this content. There is a description of what are called the Mi'kmaq Covenant Chain of Treaties, The true and false is part of the introduction. There are a couple of treaty documents, both the transcription of the 1752 treaty and the proclamation of the 1752 treaty. And that just has to do with what kinds of documents survive in the record. And then I'm just going to run through these pages just so everybody's on the same page. Some of the opening activities, the word scramble, the We Are All Treaty People, the core activity, and then some of the extension activities. We're not going to spend a long time, so this shows you the introduction pieces I was just mentioning. The opening activities, which start on page 110, there's a word scramble. Some of the teachers who worked on the volume were really keen about having the kids work with individual vocabulary words to have time to think about what a treaty means, what it signals, just to sort of, and what they found is that the word scramble helped them, just gives them, the students, time to think through some of these primary concepts. On page 112 is the We Are All Treaty activity. This is another option for an opening activity. And this activity is really geared to help students understand that all students are treaty people. This is not just a First Nation issue, but everybody who's in Canada has obligations and responsibilities that are part of treaty agreements. And then the core activity is sort of a fun activity, but it's one that gets at some of the more complicated issues about creating agreements between groups of people, and the idea is that the treaty scroll that's used on the left is used with a student who may not understand everything they're signing. It was printed in some Greek font that is supposed to, you can almost read words but not quite, and the idea is that you can find a willing student. One teacher suggested that having chocolate bars for this helps them sign things. But if you'll sign this, there's some kind of give and take for that. And then you sort of hide the translation and then move into the translation and find that the student has signed over all the book bags and other possessions from their classmates to the teacher, who can then decide what they're going to do with them. So this isn't a real simulation of exactly what's occurred, of course, but it helps students to open that space around what is the negotiation that happens and what are the risks that might be involved. And then finally, there are some extension activities on page 117 and 118, and those include creating a classroom debate with some of the true-false statements that Dr. Julian's about to go through, creating a classroom treaty where you would actually create a real agreement between the teacher and students, and one that everybody would need to uphold, and if they didn't, there would be consequences that were predetermined. Taking a closer look and examining the Mi'kmaq treaties, so using some of the treaty documents I just showed in the introduction, looking at vocabulary words in those treaties and thinking about what they mean, looking for family names, Mi'kmaq names, and tracing those. There's just sort of a visual literacy process of actually looking at the treaty documents and the treaty language. And then finally, because Donald Marshall Jr. is a very important figure in the history of treaties, there are a number of resources there, both at CBC and also on YouTube, to explore his life and legacy around treaties. So those are the extension activities. There is no slide to go with them, but you will see the curriculum outcomes that go with this unit as well. So that's just a quick overview of what's here. We are going to have a longer conversation and discussion period, so if you have questions about any of these particular pieces, we can look at those towards the end of the session. So I think at this time, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to ask Dr. Julian to come up and look at the true-false statements, and those statements are found on page 107.
So the questions are going to be on the screen soon?
Yeah, so we'll flip them up. So you want? Yeah.
Great. Hello, I'm Don Julian. I'm from Millbrook. I'm the Executive Director for Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq. And this is my first time on this type of TV. But some of the things when I'm teaching, there are some really weird questions that people ask. Some of the things, just for example, the Mi'kmaq sold their lands and their rights to it from the treaties. Well, that's false. Basically, the treaties that we signed from 1725 right up to 1779 were peace and friendship treaties. The British needed us to be allies, or at least to be neutral from the French, because they were still fighting with the French for control over the sovereignty of our land. So that's a false. We didn't give up any of our land rights whatsoever. Next question. This is just a short version of the answers. Treaty rights are special, and therefore the Mi'kmaq people are getting special rights. Well, they're sacred, but they're not really the true portion of it. It gives us special rights to hunt, fish, trap, fowl. Also, the Mi'kmaq, when the Europeans arrived, we had full control of all the land in Mi'kma'ki, which is Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and part of the Gaspé Peninsula. So they needed our cooperation with respect to being able to live with and amongst us. These are, the Mi'kmaq continue to press for conferred treaty rights with all aspects of the treaties. Even though we're being into courts and they're being recognized, we're still trying to affirm them into action. The next one. Treaties are valid and have significant legal standing. True. As I mentioned, we've gone through several Supreme Court decisions. I think our first court was in 1929 with the Supplementary case. It was early. I don't know if too many people understood the treaties at that time other than the Mi'kmaq. So there weren't very many lawyers that understood what the treaty rights would have been, other than the Mi'kmaq elders. Then we started developing more research into the treaties in the 1980s when we defended James Simon. James Simon was going through 2 different areas of land. He had to cross what I want to call is no man's land. There was Dodd's property, a reserve, and then there was Mi'kmaq property, really, but it's now under non-native hands, to the regular Indian Brook Reserve, and he got caught in between. And he was carrying a rifle, so he was charged hunting without a license. Union Nova Scotia Indians, the Native Council of Nova Scotia, and the research teams defended James Simon, and it was successful, but it was a limited type of right. It gave us a right to hunt. It wasn't expansive like the one in Marshall. As treaties are implemented, land will be taken away from current landowners. Well, that's false. As the treaties are implemented, I think the Mi'kmaq will be receiving a lot more recognition and rights to hunt, fish, trap, and gather. Landowners, it doesn't affect them. Now, when you're looking at land ownership, there's another set of ways that the First Nations people are looking at, especially us Mi'kmaq. We look at specific claims. Specific claims are under the Indian Act, and basically all they'll do is compensate the Mi'kmaq people for the loss of use of the land. But there's also comprehensive claims that deal with anything before Confederation. So specific is after Confederation, comprehensive is before 1867. And similar to Waakamatcook, nobody lost any parcel of land. There was a great big chunk of land, almost 4,000 acres of land that the Mi'kmaq had, and it was alienated. They got compensated, but they didn't get the land returned. It was kind of sad and in a way funny, because along that stretch of road, everybody had a for sale sign while the negotiations was taking place. Unfortunately, next door neighbors weren't talking to one another. The Mi'kmaq weren't talking to their non-native neighbors, telling them, hey, you don't have to worry about losing your land, because you're not, no matter if the treaty or the compensation would have been received. Well, they received the compensation, which was monetary, but they didn't get any land. We lost 4,000 acres of it, but it was still in the hands of the people that would have received it beforehand, even though it was taken illegally. So that's just quick and dirty. What I'm talking about, there's all kinds of different questions that you'll have from students. I was in Muscataba just after Marshall. Eric Shiley, who was a lawyer for the Confederacy at the time, we were talking about the Marshall case with grade 11 and 12 students. And we gave the presentation and we asked for questions. There wasn't one single hand that went up. So we had to develop a sort of a scenario. And the scenario was that I was the father and Eric was the son. And I was reading the morning paper. And in the headlines it says, Mi'kmaq people, their land claims are recognized and so many millions of dollars set aside. So I sort of played the dad and I said, well, God, what does these Indian people want anyway? They get everything free. What else do they want? And then all of a sudden, everybody's hand went up because everybody had an opinion from their parents, right? They've heard all kinds of different comments. So, I mean, it's really interesting once you get into a dialogue with the high school or even grade school kids. There's a grade 5's class in Truro that asked me about tax exemption. A little girl, grade 5, asked me about tax exemption. And she started her statement by saying, my father owns a hotel, and my father doesn't like Indian people. That was her statement. So I explored that a little bit, and I said, why doesn't your father like Native people? She said, well, hockey teams have stayed there, and they've busted up the rooms a little bit, and nobody took responsibility of it. So as we were talking, she said, but by the way, she said, but they got friends in Millbrook. I said, well, Millbrook's a First Nations community. So, I mean, they couldn't hate all the Native people. It must have been just that action that happened. So, I mean, it's interesting when you start to dialogue with children and some of the ideas that's coming from their parents. So I guess right now I'll just pass it over to Jaime. Thank you very much for listening to me. Hopefully I've helped you. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know.
Thank you. All right, so I thank you, Don, for giving us an overview of the 4 to 6. And for those who know Don, he's been in how long he's been working on, and I'm 46 now, so that's a long time, right, Don?
But I still look younger.
So we appreciate that. We have that resource within our office. Don's available, like you said, for questions. So please feel free to send questions. Like you said, you can send them to Sheila at cmms.com, or take your time. Don's email address is don@cmmns.com too. So if you want to send him at a later date question. So we started out this journey of sharing the information through professional development with the newly created Treaty Education Initiative, and Jaime has been working with them. Just recently signed the MOU on Treaty Day, but he's been part of our work here on contemporary issues and the development of our resource book here since day one, and he's had a lot of input in there. He's taught a number of courses at CBU, and with his legal background, he's able to give us not only the legal lens, but a Mi'kmaq lens to how treaties are interpreted. So I want to just call upon Jaime to come and talk a little bit here about treaties. Okay, and just quick introduction. While we were presenting, Colin Bernard has been working within Colchester area of schools. He's joined us here this afternoon, and Colin is also a member of the Grand Council, so welcome, Colin. And Mary Ellen has joined us as well. Mary Ellen has also spent a lot of her time teaching in the Sydney area. She's been working also at CBU, and she's currently the elder in residence at CBU. So welcome, Mary Ellen, and a member of our advisory council board.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for tuning in today. Teaching about treaties is a very important thing, and it's a very important thing to do at a very young age. Now, I was lucky enough that I started going to school at a time where we, as Mi'kmaq, began to have our treaty rights recognized in the schools. My mother was principal at Chapel Island, and she only took the position on one condition, is that she could teach Mi'kmaq as part of the curriculum in Chapel Island. As a matter of fact, I think my primary teacher here is sitting beside me here, Lillian Marshall, who taught in Chapel Island at the time. But it was an important step, and I think that just some of the questions I have are about how we've retained that treaty knowledge. And because I was taught at a young age by teachers and what treaties were about, and I had a conversation with my son on Treaty Day. I brought him up with me for the MOU, and I said, do you know what Treaty Day is about? And I was speaking to Mi'kmaq, because I was going to Treaty Day, and he couldn't tell me what it was. And then I said, you want to know what a Treaty Day is about? And he's only 6 years old, so how do you explain Treaty Day to a 6-year-old? And I said, it's about sharing. It's a celebration of sharing. Because at the heart of it, that's what treaties are, is instead of fighting, instead of violence, we decided to negotiate, we decided to sit down and share and figure out a way to coexist together. Now, my question for the panel is, you didn't have the same benefit as I would have in terms of getting schools to teach what treaties and what our relationship were. What are your first memories of how you came to learn about treaties? Where would you come to have heard about treaties as Mi'kmaq people? And before we go on, I just want to acknowledge we have two Giptons of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council with us today, Colin Bernard and Dr. Don Julian, who are both members of the Grand Council, and they've done a great job of retaining that knowledge. But I just wanted to recognize that before I turn it over in terms of asking a question about what are your first recollections of hearing about the treaties as Mi'kmaq?
My first recollection is when Treaty Day was introduced in Halifax, 1752 treaty peace. That was my first, I think, my first time that I really understood that there was such a thing in our history, treaties. That was my introduction.
My introduction, I guess, as a kid was hearing my grandfather talk about it. He knew about treaties. That was the late Grand Chief Silboy, Gabriel Silboy.
I heard it from my father, and it was a story told to him by his mother. But his mother heard it from his father, her father, I mean, and it was about the Mohawk and Mi'kmaq Treaty. And my great-great-grandfather went to Kahnawake to ask for the peace with the people there. And there was a name for it in Mi'kmaq. I don't know if I could think of the word. It's a highfalutin word in Mi'kmaq. So he went with another man, and my grandmother's story was that he went there and he met with the people in Kahnawake, and it wasn't just with the adults, it was started with the children. And it was the children, then the women, and the men, and that's the way it went. I don't want to go into too much here. It's a long story, but that's the way I heard it. I heard it all my life. But someday I'll write about it more. I think that the children should know about it. I mean, it starts from little children, the peace treaty.
My first introduction to the treaty, I guess, would be just from knowing that I had hunting and fishing rights, but I never knew until Treaty Day that there was a treaty that existed, and it kind of gave me a little validation. I never knew how to defend when somebody said you're allowed to hunt and fish by a non-native person. I never knew how to defend that, and the only way I could defend it is to be angry all the time about it. And I think what the treaties allowed me to do was to say that, you know, it is true. This is, you got something to back it up. And I think as a kid growing up in a public school system, I think I needed that.
Well, my first encounter with the treaties was 1970, being employed with the Union Nova Scotia Indians. I was told we got to start interviewing elders to talk about treaties, land rights, where we've lived, why we're not living there anymore. And just by going and doing research in the archives of Canada and also Nova Scotian archives and reading about the treaties and being about 21 years old and reading and seeing all the different things that happened to our people, I was pretty angry. Pretty angry. But I like everybody's saying, as you read into them and understand them and you get clarification from your elders, it means more to you. So, I mean, I've been involved in treaty and land claims research since 1970. So I've been very fortunate. There's a lot of our elders that are now passed that have given me their wisdom as to get an understanding of what treaties are all about and land claims.
I'm wondering if there's any other questions before I, turn. I know that there are some people probably listening online that might have a question for the panel here, and if there are no other questions online, I can continue to facilitate a discussion around some of the other questions I had on treaties. Now that we have this panel, but is there anything?
Yeah.
Nothing yet. Okay. One of the things that we've started to introduce is the concept we are all treaty people, and it's based on the fact that when we sign treaties, that both of us, both the Mi'kmaq and the non-Mi'kmaq, were agreeing to certain terms. Now, one of the chiefs that I talked to a lot on this was Chief Rod Gugu. He mentions that, and he makes the argument that as in terms of treaties, he says that the Mi'kmaq didn't even benefit the most from our peace and friendship treaties. And that always, comes, when I think about it, today's landscape and what the Mi'kmaq have in terms of limited reserve space and this kind of, do you think that what he's saying when he says, as Mi'kmaq, we haven't even benefited the most from treaties, is that an accurate statement? Or I'd just like to get your thoughts on how do you think the treaties have benefited not only the Mi'kmaq, but the people the settlers who came in? Don, maybe.
Wow, that's a loaded question, and it's not necessarily the peace and friendship treaties that would have began this. Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 is when France and England were trading lands between one another. The Mi'kmaq wanted to know, how can you do that without our people being involved? So they said, well, talk to the French governor. They went to the French governor, and the French governor basically told them, hey, you're only giving them lands that you allowed us to build our fortifications on. The rest of the land is yours. From 1713 to about 1762, we continued some battles with the English. And see, the English would not leave their forts. They were so darn afraid of our people. And that's why the Peace and Friendships Treaty started, because they couldn't get outside of their little allotments of fortifications, right? Because if they did, we were allies with the French. French and English were still battling, even though the Treaty of Utrecht started exchanging lands. So they started signing peace and friendship treaties with our people, starting with 1725 in New England. So basically, they just wanted us to be neutral. We haven't benefited a lot on these treaties. Even the modern treaties that we have, like the 1752 treaty, we had the right to hunt. We had to negotiate the right to hunt. Marshall case was more expansive. But what is sad and in a way funny is that even though they gave us the right to hunt, fish, trap, gather, a month later they narrowed it down. It was basically because of all the pressure that they had from the non-native fishermen and other people, right? They had a lot of pressure on them, so they narrowed the decision down. And we're still negotiating with respect to federal and provincial governments to get the right to hunt. Now, I mean, it took a while before the Mi'kmaq did sign anything, and that gave us the right to hunt in Hunter's Mountain for moose. And it was limited at first. They only gave us a quota as to how many we could get. And then under Marshall, we signed other agreements, the McKinsey agreements, where we got the right to fish. And I agree with Rod, because the people that benefited, even though we got the right, were the non-native people. Because the fishing licenses quadrupled, if not even, more. So, it cost us more money to get into the ocean than really it should have. So, Rod's statement that he thought that the non-native people benefited from our treaty, yes, the 1760 and 61 treaty that we defended Marshall under, I think they did, even though we got access to the water. And the federal government also, we had to sign. Mm-hmm. But there's a couple of First Nations communities in Nova Scotia that didn't sign because they didn't trust Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So his statement, I do agree with him. We've got stuff, but I think other people got more up from our treaty.
Did anyone else want to add anything to that, or?
I couldn't just. Right now we're studying treaties, and I just couldn't. That treaty is talking about Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, is it? Yeah, the British and the French made a peace treaty, and they divided up the land, our land, without our consultation. Like the French got Unamagi here in Prince Edward Island, and the British got mainland Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. That's what.
New Brunswick, part of New Brunswick, northern part of New Brunswick, I think the French retained, and the English had the rest of New Brunswick. So I mean, you're right. We didn't get nothing out of that.
No, we were not involved.
And I think that's where I just wanted to add on to what Lillian said, is that I think when we look at the effects of the treaties, and Rod's right, when we didn't really benefit from it, I think it was more harmful than anything else, because our people started to become dependent on things, and our hands were tied about where we could hunt and fish and live. And I think that's where it really hurt us, is that I think they started to take our freedom away that way. And I think that's was the more harm than anything else.
One of the things I think that it's important to also, when we're talking about teaching about treaties, that we have to understand that often when we talk about Mi'kmaq rights, we use the treaty as a kind of catch-all term, but within the Constitution of Canada, they recognize two sorts of rights. That is treaty rights they're written, but also the Aboriginal rights or the inherent rights. And these rights are basically those rights that we have as Mi'kmaq that weren't written in texts as part of the treaty negotiation, but were the rights that Mi'kmaq always had and always practiced, like the land rights, the rights to the resources, the right to sustain themselves, and this has been recognized by the court in a few different situations where they've said yes. While the treaty doesn't specifically state that, but this is something, a practice that the Mi'kmaq have always had, and it's part of their rights. So when I look at this, and one of the things that my father always taught me is that when we look at our treaties, the Mi'kmaq treaties, he said they're always about peace and friendship, not like the number treaties out west that are more about the surrender of land and surrender of resources. But one of the things he always mentioned to me was that the treaties didn't give the Mi'kmaq any rights. These were all things that the Mi'kmaq had already. So these weren't the treaties to saying that, this says, oh, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you, no, because the Mi'kmaq already had all that. What they were agreeing to was, we're going to end hostilities, and if you agree not to, in agreement of not attacking you, then you're going to give us provisions every year, like blankets, gunpowder, as a reward for not attacking you. So it was basically a way to come to that peace and friendship. But that's always an important thing that I wanted to mention. But in terms of teaching treaties, is there any other key concepts do you think that we need to just comes at the top of your head for teaching young children about treaties that's important to that we share with them at a young age?
I just think that it's important that they know who they are, their identity as Mi'kmaq people, as Native people, and that as such they were the first landowners of this country, and to be proud of who they are. Because not only I don't even think about the treaties. I think the loss of our language, loss of our dignity and our way of life, and to me it's just awesome. It's just incredible. But that's actually what happened, because I grew up in an era where we were not even Canadian citizens. I was born in 1940. I'll be 75 soon. And I grew up in that era where my mother told me stories about her father was the Grand Chief, and how she said, my dad was an entrepreneur. He was from the mainland. He was Native. His name was William Young. And she said to me, she said, we were so well off when your dad was here, and we never had to get a handout from the government. She said, my kids were almost all grown by the time we were getting family allowance. We were in Waikagma. And then she says, we did our hunting and fish. We never lacked for food. She said we were self-sufficient, and now, after the centralization, after we moved to Eskasoni, she said it just changed. We get your dad is dead, and she said I have all these people to take care of. I'm the youngest of a family of 12, and she said it was just so hard. We survived because of my brother's hunting and fishing skills, and my mother's determination to garden and I think too of all the things that she used to tell me about the loss of people being shy, being made fun of in town. My mother was very fair. She had blue eyes. Her father was part Native, I guess, and she never had any discrimination against herself, but she saw her elders and her people being discriminated. I too never experienced discrimination either. I saw it when we went on a truck and got to Sydney, and young boys made fun of our elders coming out of the truck. And my cousins who were with me, the boys, same age as me, were really upset about that, but they were just too humble and too timid to do anything. They were just hurt. So I think of all the hurt and sorrow that, and I think of the lands. Membertou, my community had to pay a lot of money to purchase land for our people, because our land was just small, and they had to expand and make room for more people. So anyway, that's my take on it all.
I think if we're talking about, we want something taken away from this, I think it's the fact that our people, our ancestors, had the foresight to see that they needed something in place. And I think they negotiated. They weren't savages like the books say, but they were there. We had our own government, and our ancestors had the foresight to see that we needed to do something. And I think that's one thing that I can say we could be proud of.
I think here at Membertou, with all the land expansion that's going on, I think that there could be a lesson there that children could, how big was our land in the beginning, and how come we have such a large expansion now? How did that come about? And I think that's our teachers can certainly go into that and even bring in the chief or bring in one of the counselors and find out from them exactly what was the procedure in order for there had to be something signed. Wasn't that a treaty? A sense of a treaty? Anyway, I think we have a wonderful example here that we could use at Membertou, and because there has been such a land expansion.
The land expansion came about as a result of buying land from the municipality of Sydney.
But it's the treaty of signing. That's what I'm talking
You know, you've come a long way. You've come from 2.5 acres of land.
Yeah, I know.
2.5 acres and 2 fish.
But we had to buy our own land. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
And people didn't
This
want
was
you.
originally our own land, and we
People
had to pay
didn't want-
millions of dollars.
People didn't want the Membertou. Unfortunately, people didn't want the people of Sydney.
No, they didn't want to.
They didn't want the native people in front of them, according to what I've read.
That's right.
So they put you in the woods,
Yeah.
where you are today. Now you're in a really nice
They
location.
put us on. They put these people
I
on
just don't
swamp.
want you, no,
I'm from
that's it.
Eskasoni. Beautiful Eskasoni.
Today it's the metropolis of Cape Breton.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's people that are in Sydney now are looking at Membertou. They're surprised at your success.
It's our
Which is
metropolis.
fantastic, right? But you know, when you go back, there's a lot of lessons to be heard, be taught. I mean, our people were forced on the reserve, and basically they started setting lands aside in 1783. They called them licenses of occupation. And then as settlers were coming in, they took those. We weren't compensated. We were just pushed out of the way. And then in 1810, they set aside more land. 1820, they set aside more land. By 1867, the Indian agents that were looking after us was selling our land right from underneath us. And there was nothing much we could do about it. It was for our benefit, supposedly. So, you know, it's really, you know, and our poor guys, I mean, I'm doing some research on the First World War, Second World War, and the Korean conflict. All our guys fought without being citizens of their own country. Yeah. We lost 9 guys in the First World War out of 90, in just Nova Scotia. I'm not talking the rest of the Atlantic. We had 126 guys that enlisted in the Second World War. The only thing that we were allowed was in the Army. We weren't allowed in the Royal Canadian Air Force or the Royal Canadian Navy because we were not citizens of this country, our country. And our guys, we lost 5 guys in the Second World War. Korean conflict, there was 26, we lost 1 guy. But these guys wanted employment for their families. And that was $15 a day in the First World, $15 a month for the First World War.
Yeah.
That's not a heck of a lot of money. To us today, it isn't. But maybe it was at that time.
It was.
You know, so I mean, our people were very self-sufficient. Centralization really ruined a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Because I heard my Uncle Levi Paulette, he lived in Waikagama, and he said he had a farm, he had horses, he had cows, chickens, and he was promised a brand new house in Eskasoni if he leaves. And he was also an Indian constable on his reserve. So he packed up his family, brand new house. Who wouldn't do that, right? They also told him that if you move there, if you want livestock, we'll provide it for you. All you got to do is turn the key. And some of the stories that Lillian heard, and I've heard, as we did research for the union, is that at night you could see the stars in these new houses. And the lumber was green.
I think they lived in a tent too.
In
The
winter.
tents.
I
Tents in
remember
the
that
winter.
interview.
Yeah.
Leah, did you?
The Magma have an extraordinary record at the Canadian Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of Canada. I just wondered whether you wanted to, say, when that started and why it's important, or if it's important, because a lot of what we've talked about today has been sort of knowledge within the community, which is super important, but there was a process of sort of an affirmation that came from outside, and maybe that was important, maybe not important, but.
Well, I'd like to believe that we've been really successful. I mean, we like to key on our victories a little bit more than we do on our losses. But as someone who went to law school, I had to look at both sides, and when we won and when we lost. And but I think that the Mi'kmaq have had some extraordinarily good researchers and leaders as part of the struggle for Mi'kmaq recognition of the rights starting in 1967. I know Don was one of the researchers who was his work led to us being able to convince the court in the 80s that our treaty rights were valid after generations of more than 60, 70 years of being told that Mi'kmaq didn't have rights. And we did really well in terms of getting our rights recognized in the Simon decision in 1985, our Aboriginal rights recognized in the Denny Paul Syllaboy case in 1990. 1999 was the landmark case, the big case that not only recognized that our treaty rights were valid, but we had a commercial ability to make money off of our rights, as well as the fact that the courts recognized that the entire script of the treaties is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the treaties actually meant to the Mi'kmaq people. And in 2007, we also were victorious in having our rights to domestic logging, which, truthfully, we have a court case in 2007 that says we as Mi'kmaq can gather lumber for our own furniture, fuel, houses, but I don't know how many houses have been built in the last 8 years since the Supreme Court has come down with that thing that says that we can provide for our own homes and things like that. So, but I think they're important things, and I remember listening to my father do a talk for the youth back in 2005 where he said there's one big reason why the Mi'kmaq continue to win at the courts and at the Supreme Court of Canada. And he said that reason is because we're telling the truth. When it comes down to it, you look at it and say, the Mi'kmaq have been always telling the truth when it comes to our treaties. And it's hard for the government to say that it's not the truth. And that's because of the research done, because of the stories of our elders, because of the knowledge we continue to pass down on treaties. But that's what my understanding of it is. But I can leave that to anyone else who would like to comment as well.
We haven't really exercised all our things with respect to the treaties. The 1752 treaty has also given us the right to salvage, because we were supposed to save the lives and goods of shipwrecks off the coast. So nobody's ever taken that up. But I mean, that's another livelihood. If you wanted to start a salvage operation of boats that are, that hit ground or whatever else, we have that in our treaty.
Mm-hmm. We had a chance too with that thing in Cape Breton.
Oh, that big boat.
The boat.
I don't think nobody wanted it.
We have time for one more question on me. We've got about 6 minutes left, so just to respect everybody's time.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering. Some of the questions I've always had is just it just continues to be the perseverance of Mi'kmaq. For like Mary Ellen talked about her grandfather, who was Grand Chief Gabriel Syllaboy, and in 1929, the Mi'kmaq were basically told by a court in Sydney that you had no Mi'kmaq Grand Council, that your treaties were no good, and basically just did away with our treaties and convicted him, our Grand Chief. And despite that fact, the Mi'kmaq persevered. The Mi'kmaq continued to educate their children and their grandchildren that we had rights. How were they able to do that? And despite being told by the courts, your rights don't exist, but to persevere up until 1985 to continue to hold that belief. I'm wondering, I'm fascinated by that, and I'm wondering how you recall our elders,
I think our elders were giving us an idea that we had inherent rights, and that we should be exercising them, regardless of what the other laws are saying. I mean, we had to survive, and that's the way we lived, and I think that's what taught a lot of our people.
I think the treaty existed back then. Somebody had it.
But they didn't recognize them, right?
They didn't recognize it in court, but they still saved it and told their children oral history.
I think they believed in our commitment to the crown at that time, the commitment to the English king, and what his commitment was to us. but it's just to convince others that, hey, this is still alive.
And I think they had the natural spirit and strength to believe in who they are as Mi'kmaq people, who they were, and that is what I think that gave them the push to continue. Believing in yourself will make you want to move forward, and I think that's.
And also education. I think a generation before me, I think, were able, not even a generation, 20 years, my oldest brother was 20 years older than me, and he wasn't allowed to go to high school. So I think in my day, people 10 years older than me, or maybe 15 years older than me, were allowed to go to high school, and education had a big part to play in terms of knowing we have something here, we have treaties we're signing here. And they started the organizations like the Union of Nova Scotia Indians way back in 1970, I think we were 69.
69.
Yeah.
So just before we close, we have Waigoma School is online, as well as Eel Ground School. So if there's any questions or comments from either one of the classrooms there. Phyllis, is everybody good there?
Yeah, everyone is good here.
Okay.
There's no
And,
questions. It's quite
okay.
interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. And from Eel Ground, I'm not hearing anything, Kevin, from this end. So, all right, so it is almost 4 o'clock, and like I said, I want to respect everybody's time, but I want to express my gratitude and thanks to the group. I mean, collectively, there's, over 400 years of wisdom coming at you today from this group, right? And not only that, but when you think about the teachings of their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents, and they're offered, here to share that with us today. A lot of the, Don and Colin, both their grandfather, great-grandfather, member of Grand Council, goes back, back to 1916, if not before, and that was Joe Julian, and Sandy Julian for Colin being his grandfather, and being part of the traditional Grand Council. Lillian's dad, right? Same. I mean, and grandfather, being part of Grand. So a lot of traditional leadership here to share today. And, I think that made this really a unique session, and I do appreciate you guys coming today and sharing all that. So we do have a minute left, but if there's any other questions, concerns, we're going to have another session next week from Pictou Landing next Thursday. Tuesday, next Tuesday, and we will be discussing about Nadugalim, and we'll have Gerald Glode on board, and Clifford Paul will come and join us from Membertou, and Carrie Prosper from Buckingham, and hopefully maybe former Chief Frank Muse from Bear River, who helped to create that content that we'll be sharing next Tuesday. And so we'll be signing in from Pictou Landing. So if I could ask Sister Dorothy if you could close our session. Thank everybody once again.
Gracious God, our loving Creator, we thank you for all of that has been revealed to our education teachers, to all of us. We ask you to continue to walk with us as we move forward with all this new information and with the contents of this book. And this we pray.
Thank you, sister.
I will on you. So, and thank you to Dave from First Aid Help Desk, and Kevin, and JR, and the entire team there at First Aid Help Desk.